Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eamon Tuig. I work in the wastewater program here at Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. And today we're going to be talking about identifying and managing high-strength process wastewater generated by your business. This would be applicable to food processors and others in the commercial sector or industrial sector, as well as town officials who might be interested in understanding how this will affect their wastewater system in their town. So today I'm going to focus on three areas. The first being wastewater treatment systems. We'll go through a very brief overview of those. We'll get into some high-strength process wastewater, what that means and why it can be a problem for those wastewater treatment systems. And then we will talk about pre-treatment options, what your options are as a facility, and how our pre-treatment determination process works here at the wastewater program at Vermont DEC. So to talk about wastewater very briefly, wastewater typically from residences, commercial buildings, and industrial facilities is collected into a sewer system, often called a collection system, which is basically a network of pipes that then carries that wastewater down to the wastewater treatment plant. You'll see in this presentation I've abbreviated wastewater treatment plant as WWTP, and you'll see that throughout. Now, these wastewater treatment plants can remove harmful organisms and contaminants from the wastewater, the goal being that they're discharging clean water back to a creek, river, or lake. And you can see in this pictures left to right, the left picture being what you might find at the beginning of a wastewater treatment plant, which would be some screens and mechanical ways to remove solids. Center picture is where you might do some biological removal. Now, these wastewater treatment plants are using natural bacteria that are occurring in the wastewater to break down other contaminants. And the picture on the right is of a effluent from a wastewater plant, looking very clear as it should, going back to the river or lake or receiving water. It's important to note that most wastewater treatment plants are designed to treat residential waste from households and not necessarily pollutants from industrial or commercial facilities. There are three examples here of very conventional wastewater treatment systems. The picture on the left is of a lagoon system. The one in the middle is referred to as an oxidation ditch. It is basically wastewater swirling throughout a channel system there and being aerated throughout that process. And the system on the right is what you might find in a more of a advanced system with various tanks that provide aeration or mixing depending on the needs of the facility and the steps in the process. Now, we're here today talking about process wastewater because depending on what is in your discharge coming to your wastewater treatment plant, pollutants in that wastewater can cause serious problems with either the sewage system, the collection system, the treatment plant itself, or if it makes it through untreated, it can cause problems for our receiving water in our environment. A great example of this is back in the 1960s and early 1970s when detergents at the time for washing contained high levels of phosphate, and these were passing through wastewater treatment plants, which were not did not have the capacity to remove phosphorus at the loads that they were receiving, and this caused excess phosphorus loading to lakes and other receiving waters, which causes excess growth of algae and oxygen depletion in those waters and harm to aquatic species. Those of us in Vermont, we know this very well, occurring in Lake Champlain. And of course, the EPA and the state are currently working on a total maximum daily load for phosphorus to the lakes. So this is going to have a huge impact on our treatment plants, and in turn will have an impact on businesses and what they are putting down their pipes. So what kind of businesses and industries should be concerned about the impact on their town's wastewater collection system? I apologize, that table might be a little small, but this is just an industrial facilities list that the EPA has generated. And these, if you're a facility, no matter your size, who fits under this criteria, you would be needing to have a pretreatment permit because your discharge to the treatment plant or could have interference with the treatment there, or might pass through completely untreated. I'll be showing this table again in another slide, and it will be easier to read. And then, of course, hopefully those who are interested in this webinar today are those who fall into the second category of food processors, including maybe a specific example might be a brewery, or maybe a cheese manufacturer, a dairy product manufacturer. And our big concern from the food industry would be the high strength waste, and you'll often hear that referred to as the BOD level of that waste, and we're going to talk about that next. So what is BOD? BOD is an acronym. It stands for biochemical oxygen demand or biological oxygen demand, depending on how it's used. And this is basically the amount of oxygen needed by aerobic biological organisms to break down organic material in water. So you can think of this simply as food for microorganisms. And as those microorganisms break down these sugars and alcohols and other chemicals, they're using oxygen. And as that oxygen depletes from a water system, it can cause problems not only for a treatment plant in terms of their process, because again, the treatment plant is using bacteria to break down these pollutants, but it can also cause problems for the receiving waters, because lakes and streams that have low dissolved oxygen cannot support aquatic life. And just in this example here, I've listed some sources of BOD in a brewery process. So spent grains and yeast, rinses from clean in place systems, anytime that they're washing keg returns or rinsing, or spoiled batches of or returned beer that might go down the drain. So this is all leading to the next slide, which will continue to focus on brewery wastewater. This is an industry that's growing heavily in Vermont, and one that we have focused on. You'll see that this table has some values in it for what you might find in typical sewage water versus what you might find in a brewery that is discharging wastewater from their process using good pollution prevention or poor pollution prevention. And we'll get into that a little bit later, but you could see typical BOD for sewage water is around 300. Typical BOD of a pristine stream is about 1. And then you'll see these very high numbers across the board for wastewater from a brewery. Straight beer coming out of straight down the drain has a BOD of greater than 60,000. So these are numbers that a treatment plant is not necessarily designed to handle. You'll also see that suspended solids are very high. pH of brewery water, processed water, is extremely low or acidic, and also contains a large amount of phosphorus, which we touched on earlier. And this information is obtained locally in Vermont over about the last 20 years of regulating breweries, upstarting breweries in Vermont. It's also important to note that the volume of wastewater impacts the collection system and the treatment plant. And a typical brewery process wastewater is has really high flows. So you're talking about 2 to 8 gallons of waste generated per gallon of beer. And the way that we determine the eventual BOD load to that plant is to look at the volume of the discharge and the concentration of the BOD to get an actual load. And typically breweries do trigger a pretreatment permit due to their high BOD in their discharge. And we will get into that later in the presentation. As I mentioned earlier, the pH of a brewery discharge is very low, and federal regulations prohibit the discharge of pHs of less than 5 and your typical beer, as we showed in the previous slide, is about 4.5. Many local sewer ordinances across the state require wastewater to be greater than 5.5. So there may be the need for pH adjustment depending on the amount of waste and the strength. TSS, which is another acronym for total suspended solids, it's very high in typical brewery process wastewater. As I said, phosphorus is very high, and phosphorus removal at a wastewater treatment plant is very costly, and as we touched on earlier, very crucial to protecting surface waters. And the last thing is dissolved oxygen can be very low in brewery process wastewater. This is due to the natural fermentation process of making beer. The concern being that as this water enters the collection system, it can cause odors, and as it goes septic, and as it reaches a treatment plant, can actually result in plant upsets, which can be very difficult to resolve. Getting away from breweries for a second, we can also think about other things that might enter the drain from food processing. A big one that we hear about is fats, oils, and greases. Sometimes you'll see that acronym as a FOG. And I believe many people are aware of, if you've ever been in a restaurant, if your restaurant has a grease trap, hopefully it does. And if it's not functional or not used correctly, you can end up depositing large amounts of fat, oils, and greases into the collection system. Now, of course, this can result in blockages of the collection system and sewage backups, but it can also affect the treatment process of the wastewater treatment plant by creating conditions that are unfavorable for the bacteria that are needed at that treatment plant. It creates conditions that are more favorable to filamentous bacteria and other microorganisms that can hamper the treatment process and result in upsets at the plant. So by placing controls or limits on the levels of certain pollutants in this process wastewater discharge, you'll help by preventing interference with the operation of your local sewer and your wastewater treatment plant. I have another great picture there on the top right. This is actually referred to as the Fatberg, I believe. That picture is from the sewers under London. It was a big story last year about a gargantuan-sized ball and blockage of fats and greases that created sewage backups throughout the city. And as we said earlier, preventing the introduction of such pollutants that could pass through the treatment plant completely untreated will prevent problems with treatment plant, but also when you consider the environment and impacts on the health of the public and the environment, and it's very important. And from your business perspective, this provides an opportunity to improve reuse and recycling of this wastewater, which ultimately should save the business money. Typically, wastewater treatment plants or towns will require surcharges for businesses who are discharging high levels of high-strength waste, and that's usually based on their BOD. So it's also a good business and can save money. Now, what are some ways to control the discharge? Well, this is something the Environmental Assistance Office could certainly help with. You'll also often hear these called best management practices, BMPs, pollution prevention, or simply P2. And this is a critical part of operating a business that generates a lot of processed wastewater. And these are simply everyday working practices that reduce the volume of waste and generally keep the waste products out of the processed wastewater. I've got an example there of just a simple screen system in the floor drain of a process facility, trying to keep solids and other things that are going to increase the strength of the waste out of the waste stream. Another way that we look at controlling these discharges is through pre-treatment. So you might be doing all you can, using good pollution prevention methods, but at the end of the day, your facility just generates enough high-strength waste that we need to take a next step. And that involves pre-treatment, and this is just basically having a small wastewater treatment system within the facility that removes harmful pollutants before they're being discharged to the sewer system and before they get to the wastewater treatment plant. This is a picture of a dissolved air flotation unit. You could see on the right that those solids and that's going to contribute to the high strength waste that are being skimmed off the top and separated before the liquid gets discharged. This is something you'll commonly find in large breweries and dairy manufacturers. Now, how do you know if you need a pretreatment, or if you need pretreatment? At the first place to start with this is, are you a new facility, or are you a facility that is significantly changing your discharge? If you are, then you should be considering this. The pretreatment determination is made by the Vermont DEC wastewater program, and what we would need is information about the facility, about the proposed discharge, a description of what the facility does, noting any pollutants of concern, and also what pollution prevention measures are being put in place, with very specific details on waste separation methods. The facility also must consult with the town to receive an allocation from the town in terms of what the wastewater treatment plant can handle. And we would, of course, use the wastewater treatment plant's design, hydraulic and BOD treatment capacity and their current loadings to determine the impact of your discharge on that plant. Ultimately, the determination of whether you need a pretreatment permit is based on federal regulations, which we'll get into next. And this is the table we showed earlier. The EPA has established certain criteria for what we would call a significant industrial user, and any person or any business on this list, no matter your size, would be required to have a pretreatment permit. They wouldn't need a determination, they would just have to have a permit, which would be done by our program in wastewater. If you're not in one of those categorical users, for example, a brewery or a dairy manufacturer, then the pretreatment permit is determined based on whether you fall under one of these categories: a discharge of an average of 25,000 gallons per day or more to a treatment plant, or you contribute a process waste stream like a BOD that makes up 5% or more of the typical capacity of the treatment plant. And the fourth category here is that you may be determined or designated as significant industrial user if the treatment plant has established that you have the reasonable potential to adversely affect the treatment plant operation. So this is also provided in Vermont statute, which requires that a pretreatment permit be obtained when a discharge into a treatment plant can adversely impact the proper operation of the treatment process or pass through without proper treatment. Now, you may not need a pretreatment permit, and many small facilities connecting to large treatment plants do not trigger our pretreatment program. Municipalities can regulate small facilities at the local level, and the amount of pretreatment needed may be predicated on the BOD allocated by the municipality. As long as municipalities allocate sufficient BOD such that the brewery or facility can implement proper pollution prevention and meet the BOD limitations. Of course, the discharge must comply with the local sewer ordinance, and understand that municipalities via their sewer ordinance have the right to inspect and monitor and require facilities to monitor discharges into their collection systems or report. Who do I ultimately contact if I have questions about this? A good place to start is at the local level, and reach out to your municipal official regarding wastewater allocation. The Vermont DEC Environmental Assistance Office is also a great place to start regarding pollution prevention. And if you're curious about whether you need a permit, your Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation Regional Office engineer can provide assistance with permitting. You can also consult a local engineering firm for design and consultation. And ultimately, the wastewater program here at the Vermont DEC would be responsible for a pre-treatment determination. That's all I have for today. So if you'd like to reach out to all of us or any of us, please do. And I'll hand this back over to Roland to wrap it up.
All right, thanks, Eamon, and thank you all for attending. Just a reminder, we have one more webinar tomorrow at lunch discussing hazardous waste generation for food and beverage processors throughout the state of Vermont. The speaker tomorrow will be Lynn Metcalf. She's a pollution prevention expert with the Environmental Assistance Office here at DEC. Today's webinar, as well as yesterday's and tomorrow's, will all be posted on our website. And please mark your calendars again for our roundtables coming up. Rutland on the 13th of September and St. Albans on the 15th of September. Our website is eaovt.org. Once again, thank you very much for attending, and we hope to see you tomorrow.